America is known as the land of opportunity, where you can achieve anything you want no matter who you are or where you came from, the famous American dream. And I mean, why not? It is the world's largest economy with some of the richest companies, prestigious universities, world-class healthcare, and a diverse population from many different backgrounds. If there is one country in the world that would be a great place to get a good job, build a family, and live happily ever after, surely it would be here, right? Well, not exactly. Because behind this facade of massive wealth and riches, there are major problems in America in that its people, especially the middle class, are being squeezed out economically and psychologically. And while most Americans are not necessarily poor, they are living in constant stress of limited economic security, where one major setback can thrust them into economic chaos. For example, a survey by Pew Research in 2020 found that 52% of middle-income adults don't have rainy day funds that could last them 3 months. Housing affordability is at its lowest point in history. Middle-income households spend roughly 40% of their entire salary on housing alone, with the poor spending even more. Healthcare costs are getting more and more expensive, and consumer debt is at an all-time high. During my research for this video, I have encountered stories online where many families who are classified as middle class feel like they are essentially living in poverty due to the high cost of living, let alone the actual poor people. This is an even bigger problem than you might think. The middle class represents 50% of American adults, and most of us identify ourselves as middle class, so this problem likely applies to you as well. Today, we will examine how despite the country being richer than ever, Americans are still struggling. We'll look at the structural issues of the economy, the cycle of poverty, and the challenges that these people face. This is the dark side of America's economic success. Alright. So over the past several decades, the United States has undergone a remarkable transformation, with income growth stalling for the poor and the middle class, despite the incomes of those at the top continuing to rise dramatically compared to the rest of the population. Between 1979 and 2007, 1 year before the Great Recession, median family income rose by 35%, while income for those in the top 1% rose by a whopping 278%. Families from the middle class do pull away from those at the poorest level, and there are people who manage to rise their status from poor to the middle class, but they can only achieve these paltry income gains by working longer hours, increasing their labor supply, particularly relevant among wives and mothers, and by increasing household debts to maintain their consumption level as wages fail to keep up with inflation. But why is that? Well, the most well-known reason is that there is a growing inequality between the top 10% and everyone else. This does not necessarily mean that the rich are exclusively to blame for everyone else's problems, but it does mean that for whatever reason, they are getting the larger share of the pie. This in turn increases the disparity where the rich are getting richer, while everyone else is not necessarily becoming poorer but stagnating. With that in mind, I want to explain some theories of why America is the way it is, and why the gap between the rich and everyone else is widening. So, it's not exactly your fault if you find yourself struggling with all of this. The first one is about the reproduction of class structure. Basically, this theory states that most people will end up in the same income class as their parents. People who are born from poor blue-collar families are likely to grow up and become poor blue-collar workers. Similarly, people who are from high-income families will tend to grow up to become high-income workers or business owners. This happens because people use their resources to protect their advantages and pass them on to their children. So those who are born with fewer resources are naturally disadvantaged. Now, this seems kinda obvious, but it actually goes straight against the American dream. A belief that Americans can gain upward social mobility through hard work and effort regardless of social class. But the evidence says otherwise. This paper, titled The Fading American Dream, written by Stanford economics professor Richest, found that absolute income mobility, aka the percentage of children who earn more than their parents, has fallen from 90% for children born in the 1940s to about 50% for children born in the 1980s, meaning that half of American adults today earn less income than their parents, as opposed to only 10% of children born in the 1940s. This happened despite a massive increase in GDP growth over the last 40 years, meaning that wealth distribution in America is becoming more and more unequal, and the American dream has become increasingly unattainable for more and more Americans despite the country being richer than ever. People cannot alter the class structure into which they are born. It is out of their control. Thus, they have limited options to begin with. While some people who are talented and hardworking will be able to move upwards of the income ladder, like from poor to middle income or middle income to rich, most of them will remain as what they were when they were born, including those who are just as talented and hardworking. That sounds depressing, but it is becoming more prevalent today. Now, another factor that reinforces this cycle of poverty and stagnation is macroeconomic conditions. It is no secret that economic downturns like a recession, depression, or stagflation can place a heavy burden on everyone, but particularly on poor and middle-income people. Inflation, for example, disproportionately affects those in low-income brackets. There are two reasons why this happens. One is that poor people tend to hold most of their financial assets in cash instead of interest-bearing or investment assets like stocks, bonds, or real estate. So people who cannot afford to invest are exposed to the risk of inflation, eroding the purchasing power of their money, compared to rich people who have the majority of their wealth invested in productive assets. 2. Poor and lower middle income workers, especially if they work in the blue-collar industry, tend to have lower job security. So in the event of a recession or periods of high inflation, they're usually the first type of worker to be laid off. If the recession is severe enough, it can have a long-term impact on poverty and the livelihood of many people, even years or even decades after the recession has ended. In economics, this is called hysteresis, and it usually happens through human capital shocks. For example, if the number of poor children dropping out of school increases during a recession, as they can no longer afford education, that may lead to lower future income for them and subsequently lower output for the economy as a whole. And this effect will persist years after the recession has ended, which further complicates the poverty problem. Furthermore, there are many more macroeconomic conditions like increasing housing costs and stagnating wages that again disproportionately affect poor people. The high housing prices widen the gap between the rich and the poor in terms of wealth and opportunity. The rich, who already own multiple homes as investment properties, can benefit from the appreciation of their assets and use them as collateral for borrowing or investing. People who do not own homes will face difficulties in saving for a down payment or qualifying for a mortgage, especially with low income and low credit scores. The fact that housing prices are at an all-time high with wages not keeping up is extremely problematic, and I can make a long video just talking about that. So we'll just leave that for now. Okay, so the next factor that creates this cycle of poverty and struggle for the people is labor market segmentation. Now, I'm certain that you already know that low-skilled workers or young workers, especially those working in blue-collar industries like mining or construction, tend to have poor working conditions, which is quite as expected. However, the idea of labor market segmentation is that differences in working conditions between workers cannot be attributed to their skills and productivity alone. It suggests that there are two sectors in the labor market: primary and secondary. The primary sector is characterized by well-paid stable jobs, opportunities for advancement, and good working conditions, and they often work in large capital-intensive businesses. These are jobs that require certain standards of higher education, usually a college degree or maybe even higher. Meanwhile, The secondary sector is characterized by instability, uncertainty, and poorer working conditions, such as lower salaries, limited access to training and development, and a higher risk of work-related accidents and health issues. And most of these jobs are held by poor and lower middle income workers that unfortunately don't have the privileges of higher education. When people take on these poor quality jobs, they may experience low pay, atypical to downright crazy working hours, and have limited access to training, housing, and social security, with dire consequences for both physical and mental health. To make things even worse, workers in the secondary sector experience scarring effects, meaning that the longer you work in this sector, you're less likely to gain employment in the more lucrative and stable sector, which means you're probably working these kinds of jobs for your entire life. Just think about it. A 40-year-old construction worker whose entire life revolves around construction will have little to no chance of pivoting his career entirely to work as an accountant, for example, simply because of the stigma associated with the construction worker, even if he actually had the skills to work as an accountant. Now, the reasons why this happens are still debated, but it is most likely a combination of employment regulations, especially evident in jobs with temporary contracts, business cycles, such as those that graduated during a recession will be disadvantaged, technological advancement, and discrimination all help to cause a segmented labor market. Okay, so the next factor that we'll discuss here is discrimination, and it's probably the easiest factor to understand. Things like gender pay gap or racial discrimination in workplace that unfortunately still exists, albeit much progress in the last decade. But those examples are actually nothing compared to the real factor that we're going to look at here, and that is institutionalized discrimination, which is much harder to notice or to solve. It is when governments had laws that segregated minorities in every aspect of human life: voting, employment, education, healthcare, and many others. This is most evident in South Africa during the apartheid days from 1948 to the 1990s, only ending after Nelson Mandela was elected president. In more developed countries like the US, the real culprit is private sector discrimination. It is when banks make it more difficult for certain people to get a mortgage, as they are perceived to have a higher likelihood of default. And even if they do provide the mortgage, it will usually come with precarious conditions like higher down payment or higher interest rates. This actually happened during the housing boom leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, when middle-class minorities became the target of predatory lending. You see, one of the factors that contributed to the 2008 financial crisis was the expansion of subprime mortgages, which are loans offered to borrowers who are not qualified to take those loans. These loans are predatory in nature because most of them had adjustable interest rates that were pretty low at the start of the loan period, but will then increase significantly in the future. Of course, people didn't know this, and they were offered a mortgage with a 4% interest rate and gladly took it, only for that interest rate to double 2 years down the line without their knowledge. When the interest rates finally rose and the housing market eventually collapsed, the result was the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. As you have already guessed, minorities, especially middle-class minorities, are the main target of this very scheme. Another example are school or college admissions, when schools and universities discriminate against minority students for perceived incompetency. The main problem with institutionalized discrimination is that they're much harder to see, because this type of discrimination is seemingly a part of the structure of these organizations. It is difficult to root out. For example, the bankers that provided predatory lending for subprime borrowers may not have any bad intentions. However, because the discrimination itself is so embedded in their standard operating procedure, they may assume that these practices are fair and normal. So oftentimes, people working in these organizations may not even be aware of what they've done. When all of these factors are combined, they create a vicious cycle that puts the poor and the middle class at a significant disadvantage. For a time after World War II ended all the way to the 1970s, The US economy entered a period of sustained growth and prosperity, fueled by consumer spending, suburbanization, and technological innovation. The middle class expanded and enjoyed higher standards of living as they bought cars, TVs, and washing machines. Unfortunately, while standards of living in general have massively improved since then, many people are still struggling to pay for housing, healthcare, student loans, and more, even when living in the most successful country on earth. Now, if you want to know how the fourth richest country on earth can turn into a failed state, check this video on Venezuela's economic collapse right here. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.